The child was supposed to be in the creche bay when the sirens started. Velcia Cohn was not in the creche bay. She was in the forward observation gallery of the TCS Adamant Vigil, pressed flat against the cold transparency of the viewport with both palms spread wide, watching the stars. She was 9 years old. She had been 9 years old for exactly 11 days, and the only birthday present she had asked for was permission to watch the carrier group's transit through the Harrow corridor from the gallery, instead of the sealed, windowless compartment, where the other dependents would spend the jump behind blast shutters and a marine guard. Her mother had said no. Her mother had said it 3 times, each time with increasing precision about the dangers of decompression, radiation spikes, and the particular vulnerability of a 9-year-old skull to high-energy particle scatter. Commander Adea Cohn did not soften things for children. She believed that the universe was hard, and that pretending otherwise did a child no favors. Velcia loved her for it and ignored her roughly 40% of the time. The gallery was empty because it was supposed to be sealed during transit. Velcia had memorized the maintenance rotation 3 days ago and timed her entry to the 4-minute gap between Petty Officer Darren's inspection sweep and the automated lock cycle. She had exactly 12 minutes before the system would flag her presence and alert the duty officer. She intended to use every one of them. The Harrow corridor was not beautiful in any way that a recruitment poster would recognize. It was a navigational shortcut through a region of compressed interstellar medium, dense with charged particles that painted the viewport in shifting curtains of pale violet and deep amber, like looking through stained glass that would not hold still. The carrier group moved through it in formation. The Adamant Vigil at center, her 2 escort destroyers running parallel at 8,000 meters, and somewhere behind them, invisible but present on every tactical display, the logistics frigate Constant Provision carrying supplies for a 6-month deep patrol. Velcia did not care about the formation. She cared about the light, the way it shifted. The way the particles caught the carrier's running lights and threw them back in colors that did not exist in any paint set she owned. She pressed her forehead against the viewport and breathed a small circle of fog onto the transparency and watched it shrink. Then the siren started. Not the transit warning, not the decompression klaxon. The sound she heard was the one her mother had described exactly once, in the flat voice she used when she was being precise about things that mattered. The 3-tone ascending chime followed by a sustained low note that meant contact. Not weapons contact, not collision warning. Contact. The kind that had never happened before in the entire history of the Terran Confederacy. The kind that meant something was out there, and it was not human, and it was close. Velcia pulled her palms off the viewport and stood very still. The gallery lights shifted to amber. The automated lock she had bypassed engaged with a heavy thunk, sealing her inside. She was locked in the forward observation gallery of a carrier that had just detected the first non-human intelligence in human history, and she was alone, and she was 9. She should have been terrified. She was not. She was something else entirely, something she did not have a word for yet, a feeling like standing at the edge of a high place and realizing that the drop was not a threat but an invitation. She looked out the viewport, and she saw them. They came out of the charged particle field like a migration. Not ships, not in any shape she recognized. They were organic, or they looked organic. Vast elongated forms, each one at least a kilometer long, their surfaces rippling with bioluminescent light that pulsed in synchronized waves across the entire formation. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They moved through the Harrow corridor in a pattern that was too coordinated to be accidental and too fluid to be mechanical, like a school of fish scaled up to the size of mountains, and every one of them was glowing. The colors were wrong, not wrong in a broken way. Wrong in a way that meant her eyes were seeing something they had not been built to process. Shifting gradients of deep blue and living green, threaded with veins of gold that pulsed in rhythms she could almost count. The smallest ones were the size of the escort destroyers. The largest ones dwarfed the adamant vigil, their bodies extending beyond the edges of the viewport, their bioluminescence casting moving shadows across the gallery floor. Velsha stood at the viewport and watched them, and the feeling that had no name settled deeper into her chest, displacing everything else. They were alive. She knew it the way she knew that a dog was alive and a rock was not, the way she knew that the particular way a thing moved told you whether it had something inside it that cared about where it was going. These things cared. They moved with intention. They adjusted their positions relative to each other in small, precise corrections that spoke of awareness, of attention, of the kind of coordination that required each part to know where every other part was. A hive. The word surfaced from a biology lesson she had half listened to and fully remembered. A collective organism, a species that was not a collection of individuals but a single mind expressed through many bodies. She pressed closer to the viewport and tried to see their faces. They did not have faces, not in any way she understood. But along their leading edges, clusters of structures caught the ambient light and reflected it back in patterns that seemed deliberate, seemed aware. They were not eyes, they were something else. Something that served the same purpose, to take in the universe and know it. One of the larger hive forms passed within 2 kilometers of the gallery, and its bioluminescence cast a wash of blue-green light across Velsha's face and hands, and the entire room behind her. For a moment the gallery looked like the inside of an aquarium, lit from outside by something vast and living and very close. Velsha held her breath and felt the vibration of its passage through the deck plates, a low-frequency pulse that traveled up through her boots and into her chest, where it settled beside the feeling that still had no name. The creature's surface was textured like nothing she had seen. Ridged and branching, with structures that pulsed independently of the main bioluminescent pattern, small nodes of light that traveled along channels in the chitinous surface like signals being passed from nerve to nerve. It was thinking. She could see it thinking, the way you could see a person thinking when their eyes moved and their jaw shifted and their fingers tapped against their leg. The creature's thoughts were visible, written in light on its own body. She pressed her palm flat against the viewport and held it there. The carrier group had stopped. She could feel it in the deck, the subtle shift in vibration as the engines dropped from transit power to station keeping. The formation was holding position. The hive forms were holding position. 2 groups of living things, suspended in the charged amber light of the Harrow corridor, looking at each other for the first time. Behind her she heard footsteps, running. The gallery door cycled open with a manual override, and Petty Officer Darren appeared, his face flushed, his sidearm drawn, his eyes wide with the particular expression of a man who had just realized that his most boring duty station had become the most exposed point on the ship. Velsha Cohn, you need to come with me right now." She did not move. She was watching the nearest hive form, one of the smaller ones, only 500 or 600 meters long. It had separated from the formation and was drifting closer to the carrier group, its bioluminescence shifting from the synchronized blue-green pulse of the collective to something different, something individual. A ripple of warm amber that started at what she decided was its head and traveled the length of its body in a slow wave, like a greeting, like a hand being raised. "Velsha." "It's saying hello," she said. Darren stared at her. Then he looked out the viewport and saw what she was seeing, and his hand on the sidearm went slack. On the bridge of the adamant vigil, Commander Adea Cohn watched the same tableau from a very different vantage. Her tactical display was saturated with contacts. The sensor officer, Lieutenant Commander Mara Hessing, had stopped trying to count them at 400 and was now running classification algorithms that returned the same result every time. Biological, unknown, no match in any database. "Mass estimate on the nearest contact," Cohn said. Her voice carried the particular flatness that her bridge crew recognized as maximum focus. Approximately 80,000 metric tons, Commander. Hull composition appears to be a chitinous polymer matrix reinforced with metallic compounds. No detectable weapon systems. No detectable propulsion signature. They appear to be moving through direct manipulation of the local particle field. "They're swimming," said Chief Tactical Officer Rennick from the weapons console, his voice carefully neutral. "In space, they're swimming in the charged medium." Threat assessment. Indeterminate. No weapons signatures, no targeting locks, no aggressive formation changes. But Commander, there are at minimum 400 of them, some massing in excess of our displacement, and they are demonstrating the ability to manipulate the particle field we are currently navigating through. If they compress the medium around us, they could crush the formation without firing a shot. Cohn absorbed this. 22 years of fleet service had taught her to distinguish between threats and unknowns, and this was still an unknown. The absence of weapons did not mean the absence of danger, but the absence of aggressive behavior meant something. Something she was not willing to waste by reacting too quickly. "Comms, any transmission from the contacts?" Lieutenant Sorrell at the communication station shook his head. "No electromagnetic transmissions of any kind, Commander, but the bioluminescent patterns are exhibiting structured variation. The xenolinguistics module is flagging them as potentially communicative." Potentially. The patterns repeat in nested sequences, base rhythms overlaid with modulating secondary and tertiary pulses. The module calls it consistent with language but cannot decode it. "Because we have nothing to decode it against," Hessing added quietly. "These are not like anything we have ever encountered. We have no reference frame." Cohn looked at the main display. The nearest hive form, the small one that had separated from the collective, was now holding position 4 kilometers from the adamant vigil's bow. Its amber pulse continued, slow and steady, like a heartbeat offered for inspection. "Where is my daughter?" Cohn asked. The question landed on the bridge like a stone dropped in still water. Darren's voice came through the internal comm, tight with embarrassment and something else. "Forward observation gallery, Commander. She was here when the siren sounded. She is secured. She is watching the contacts through the viewport." "Is she in danger?" "No, ma'am. The gallery is rated for combat conditions, but she is closer to the nearest contact than any other person on the ship." Cohn closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, her expression had not changed. "Leave her there, keep eyes on her. If anything changes, pull her immediately." She turned back to the tactical display and began the work of deciding how to greet something that had been waiting in the dark between stars for however long it had been waiting, and had chosen this moment, this corridor, this formation, to show itself. Velsha was still at the viewport when the hive form changed. It had been holding position, pulsing its amber greeting for almost 20 minutes. Velsha had counted the pulses, 107. Each one identical in duration and intensity, each one traveling the length of the creature's body in exactly the same wave pattern, head to tail, like a signal being sent and sent and sent to someone who had not yet answered. On the 108th pulse, the pattern broke. The amber wave started at the head as before, but instead of traveling the full length of the body, it stopped at the midpoint and reversed, flowing back toward the head, where it split into 2 streams that traveled along the creature's dorsal and ventral surfaces simultaneously, meeting at the tail in a burst of bright gold that held for 3 full seconds before fading. Then it did it again, the same pattern, head to midpoint, reverse, split, converge, burst. And again. Velsha pressed closer to the viewport. The feeling in her chest was expanding, pushing against her ribs, making her breath come faster. She recognized what the creature was doing because she had done it herself, 2 years ago, standing on the observation deck of Meridian Station, watching the cargo haulers come and go, waving at every one of them even though none of them could see her. Waving and changing the wave, making it bigger, making it different, trying to get anyone to notice. The hive form was trying to get her attention. Not the carrier, not the bridge, not the weapons arrays or the sensor dishes or the communication antennae. It was oriented directly at the forward observation gallery, its leading surface angled toward the viewport where a 9-year-old girl stood with her palms flat against the transparency, and it was changing its pattern because the old pattern was not getting a response. Velcia did not think about what she did next. She did not consider the protocols she had heard her mother recite. She did not weigh the diplomatic implications or the military risks or the 1,000-year consequences that the adults on the bridge were trying to calculate. She was 9. She had spent her entire life on ships and stations, surrounded by adults who measured everything, calculated everything, who turned the universe into numbers and probabilities and threat assessments. She lifted her right hand off the viewport and waved. A small wave, fingers spread, hand moving side to side, the universal human gesture of hello that she had learned before she could speak. She waved at the kilometer-long bioluminescent organism floating 4,000 meters from her face, and she smiled. The creature's entire body flared gold. Not the slow pulse of the greeting pattern, not the structured wave of the modified signal. A single, instantaneous flash of warm gold that lit up the gallery like sunrise, that threw Velcia's shadow against the back wall of the observation room, that was so bright Darren shielded his eyes and reached for her shoulder to pull her back. She shook him off. She was watching. The gold faded, and in its place something new. The creature's bioluminescence reorganized itself into a pattern Velcia had never seen. A slow, spiraling glow that started at its center and expanded outward in concentric rings, each ring a slightly different shade, moving from deep amber at the core through gold and pale yellow to almost white at the edges. It looked like a target. It looked like a flower opening. It looked like something saying, "I see you." Behind Velcia, Darren's comm crackled. "Bridge, this is observation gallery." The nearest contact just exhibited a major luminescent response. It appeared to react to Velcia, to the girl. She waved at it and it responded. Silence on the channel. Then her mother's voice, stripped of every emotion except the careful control that Velcia knew meant she was feeling all of them at once. "Explain." She waved, Commander, through the viewport. The contact's bioluminescence changed immediately. The xenolinguistics module is going wild. It's registering the response as a structured reply. Another silence, longer. "Do not interfere with her," Cone said. Over the next 2 hours, Velcia conducted the first conversation between human and alien intelligence. She did not know that was what she was doing. She knew only that the creature responded when she moved, and that its responses made a kind of sense she could feel even if she could not explain it. When she pressed both palms flat against the viewport, it dimmed its glow to a steady, warm amber. When she pulled her hands away, the glow brightened, as if reaching for her. When she drew a circle on the fog transparency with her fingertip, the creature's bioluminescence arranged itself into a ring of light that matched the proportions of her drawing. She drew a triangle. It made a triangle. She drew a square. It made a square, then added a second square rotated 45 degrees inside the first, and a third inside that, each one smaller, a nested cascade that repeated until the lines were too fine for its bioluminescence to resolve. It was not copying. It was extending. Taking her idea and running with it, the way a classmate might grab a drawing and add a background and a sky and a sun. Velcia grinned. She breathed another fog circle onto the viewport and drew a spiral, starting small and widening outward. The creature responded with a spiral of its own, but this one moved. The light traveled along the spiral's path in real time, spinning outward from the center, accelerating as it went, until the outermost arc pulsed and released a burst of free-floating luminescence that drifted away into the cleared corridor like sparks from a fire. A spiral that launched something. A spiral that went somewhere. She drew a star, 5 points the way she always drew them, with the lines crossing in the center. The creature paused for longer than it had paused before, and its photosensitive clusters shifted, focusing not on the drawing but on the viewport itself, on the stars visible beyond and behind Velsha's head. Then it produced a shape that was not a 5-pointed star but a cluster of light sources, each one a different intensity, arranged in a pattern she did not recognize at first. It took her 30 seconds to understand. The creature had drawn a real constellation, an actual arrangement of stars as seen from some vantage she could not imagine, and each light source pulsed at a rate that corresponded to its brightness, and the whole thing rotated slowly, showing her the constellation from different angles. It was showing her its sky, its home sky. Velsha's breath caught. She drew her own constellation, the one her mother had shown her through the viewport of Meridian Station when she was 6, Orion's belt, 3 dots in a line. The creature studied it, reproduced it, and then placed it beside its own constellation, the 2 sky patterns side by side, each one rotating at its own pace. 2 skies, 2 homes, both real. She drew a stick figure. The creature paused. Its light rippled through several configurations, searching for something, and then it produced a shape that was not a stick figure but was clearly an attempt at one. A central vertical line with branching horizontals and a circle at the top, rendered in bands of shifting color. It was imperfect. It was clearly the work of something that had never seen a human form before, and was trying to reproduce it from the crude abstraction a 9-year-old had drawn in breath fog on a window. Velsha laughed. The sound carried through the gallery, clear and bright, and she pressed her face against the viewport and drew another figure, this one with arms raised in a V, the victory sign, the celebration pose she struck whenever she won at strategy games against the Marines who let her play during off-shifts. The creature reproduced the figure. Then, without prompting, it added a second figure beside it, different in proportion, with longer limbs and a broader base and no circle at the top. An alien figure, its own body shape, rendered in the same crude visual language. A picture of the 2 of them, side by side. Velsha's eyes burned. She blinked hard and fast and pressed her forehead against the viewport and whispered, "Hello." The creature could not hear her through the vacuum, but its light shifted to the deepest, warmest amber she had seen, and it held that color, steady and unflickering, for a long time. On the bridge, the xenolinguistics module was processing the exchange at maximum capacity. Lieutenant Sorrell's screens were filled with pattern analyses, correlation matrices, and a growing dictionary of bioluminescent symbols that the module was constructing in real time from the creature's responses to Velsha's drawings. "Commander," Sorrell said quietly, "the module has established initial pattern correlations. The contact is not simply mimicking her drawings, it is interpreting them and responding with additional information. The circle she drew was reproduced as a ring with internal radial structure, which may represent a conceptual expansion, not just a shape but a concept, wholeness, completeness, unity. And the constellation exchange. That is what concerns me, Commander. The contact did not merely reproduce an arrangement of light points. It displayed a stellar cartographic projection that matches no catalog in our database. The stars it showed are real, gravitationally coherent, and the luminosity ratios are consistent with main sequence and giant-class objects. Wherever this species comes from, the contact just showed your daughter the way home." Cone absorbed that. A species that shared its home coordinates with a child it had known for 90 minutes. Either that was the most profound act of trust she had ever witnessed, or it was the most dangerous piece of intelligence ever delivered to a Terran warship, or both. And when the girl drew Orion's belt, the contact placed the 2 constellations side by side, 2 origins, 2 reference frames, and then it added a line between them. Sorrel paused. A route, Commander, or an aspiration. The module cannot distinguish between a map and a wish. Cone stood at the center of her bridge, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the main display where the magnified image of her daughter's viewport was overlaid with the sensor feed from the nearest contact. Her daughter, small and sharp-featured and fearless in the way that only someone who had not yet learned to be afraid could be, drawing pictures on a fogged window for a creature the size of a warship. "The rest of the formation," Cone said, "what are they doing?" Hessing checked her displays. "Holding position. The collective pulse pattern has shifted. Before the exchange, all contacts were synchronized in a blue-green baseline. Now the majority have transitioned to the amber pattern that the nearest contact was exhibiting before the girl's response. The module interprets this as collective attention. They are all watching. 400 organisms, each the size of a capital ship, are all watching my 9-year-old daughter draw pictures on a window." "Yes, Commander." Rennick leaned forward at the weapons console. "Commander, I need to flag something. We have been running passive thermals on the formation since contact. The hive forms are not just holding position. They are metabolically active. Energy output across the formation has increased by 14% since the exchange began. They are not resting. They are doing something." "Hostile." "Unknown. But if 400 organisms simultaneously increase their metabolic output by 14%, the aggregate energy involved exceeds the total output of this carrier group by a factor of 30. Whatever they are doing it with more power than we possess." Cone looked at the display for a long moment. The hive forms filled the Harrow corridor in every direction, their amber light turning the charged particle field into something that looked, from a distance, like a living sunset. They had stopped moving. Every one of them was oriented toward the adamant vigil, toward the small transparency at the forward observation gallery, toward the child. "The energy increase," Cone said. "Does it correlate with any external action?" Hessing ran the comparison. "Yes, Commander, it correlates with the bioluminescent exchange. Specifically, every time the contact produces a complex response to the girl's drawings, the entire formation's energy output spikes briefly and then settles at a new, higher baseline. The module's interpretation is that the collective is processing the exchange together. All 400 organisms are thinking about what the child is saying." "They are learning," Sorrel said quietly. "Every drawing she makes, every response they generate, the entire collective integrates. They are not just watching, they are building a model, of her, of us." Cone turned to face her bridge crew. Every officer was watching her, waiting for the order that would define how humanity handled this moment. She thought about the energy readings. She thought about the constellation map, 2 home skies connected by a line of light. She thought about her daughter, asleep in her bunk most nights by 2100, drawing on a foggy window at an age when most children still needed help tying their boots. "Comms," Cone said. "Signal the formation. All ships hold position. Weapons remain cold. No active scanning. We are not going to be the species that answered a greeting with a threat assessment." 3 hours after the exchange began, the hive changed. Velsha felt it before she saw it. A vibration in the deck, deeper than the carrier's engines, a resonance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the particle field outside the viewport began to move, not in the random curtains of charged plasma she had been watching since transit began, but in organized streams, flowing toward the nearest hive form and then outward again in a widening pattern, like ripples from a stone dropped in water. The creature was doing something to the medium around them. On the bridge, alarm sounded. Rennick's voice was sharp, particle field compression around the formation. "The nearest contact is reshaping the local medium. Commander, If this is a weapon, we have approximately 90 seconds before the pressure differential. It is not a weapon, Sorrel interrupted, his voice carrying an urgency that overrode rank. The particle flow is structured. The module is reading it as a continuation of the communicative exchange. The contact is not compressing the field around us. It is clearing it. It is creating a low-density corridor between its position and the gallery. A corridor, Cone repeated. A path, Commander. It is making a path between itself and the girl. Cone looked at the main display. The visualization showed it clearly. A tunnel of reduced particle density, approximately 300 meters wide, extending from the nearest hive form directly to the adamant vigil's bow. The charged particles that had filled the Harrow corridor were being gently pushed aside, creating a clear lane of empty space. Not threatening, inviting. A path, a bridge, a hand extended. Commander, Hessing said. The contact is also reducing its own bioluminescence along the facing surface. The module reads this as a reduction of stimulus, a lowering of intensity. In behavioral terms, it is making itself smaller, less bright, less overwhelming. It is adjusting itself for the scale of the person it is talking to. Sensor resolution through the cleared corridor is extraordinary, Hessing continued, her voice shifting from analysis to something closer to awe. Without the particle interference, we are getting hull-quality imaging at 4 kilometers. Commander, the organism's surface is covered in substructures, not random growth, architecture. There are channels, conduits, branching networks that resemble circulatory systems and neural pathways simultaneously. And the juvenile subunits I mentioned earlier, the ones clustered near the facing surface, they are arranged in a formation. They are organized around the cleared corridor flanking it, like an honor guard. An honor guard for a 9-year-old, Rennick said. Or a welcoming committee. The module cannot distinguish between ceremonial deference and hospitality. They may be the same thing for this species. Cone's throat tightened. She recognized the behavior. She did it herself every night when she sat on the edge of Velsha's bunk and lowered her voice and made herself small and soft in a way she never was on the bridge, because that was what you did when you loved something that was smaller than you. You made yourself fit. The creature was making itself fit for a child. The escort destroyer Resolute Keel hailed on the TAC channel. Captain Odera's voice, dry and controlled. Vigil, this is Keel. We have a clear firing solution on the nearest contact if you need it, but I want you to know that my sensor officer just asked me to make sure we don't need it. She has a daughter, Commander. She is watching the same feed we are all watching. Noted, Keel, hold your position, weapons cold. Understood, Keel out. And Commander, for whatever it is worth, my sensor officer says the girl is braver than any of us. The channel closed. Cone did not respond. She did not need to. Every person on her bridge had heard the same thing, and every one of them was thinking the same thought, that a species had crossed the interstellar dark and chosen to introduce itself not to the carrier group's weapons or its sensors or its command structure, but to the one person on the ship who had thought to look out a window and wave. In the gallery, Velsha watched the path form. The charged particles swirled away from the space between her and the creature, and through the cleared corridor, she could see its surface directly for the first time, unobscured by the amber haze of the particle field. The surface was not smooth. It was covered in structures, ridges and valleys and branching formations that looked like coral, or like the neural networks she had seen in her mother's medical textbooks, or like the root systems of the ancient trees in the botanical archive she visited whenever the Vigil docked at Meridian Station. Living architecture. Complex. Beautiful. Old. She could see smaller forms moving along the surface. Tiny in comparison, perhaps 10 or 20 meters long, with the same bioluminescent capacity as the larger body, but expressing it in faster, more varied patterns. Children. She was certain of it, the way she was certain of everything she felt during this encounter, with a clarity that bypassed thought and arrived fully formed. The smaller forms were children of the larger organism, or subunits of the collective, or both, and they were clustered along the edge closest to the gallery, oriented toward her. They were looking at her the way she was looking at them. One of the small forms separated from the surface and moved into the cleared corridor. It was perhaps 15 meters long, a miniature version of the larger organism, its bioluminescence cycling through rapid, uncoordinated bursts of color: blue, amber, gold, green, white, blue again. Not the steady patterns of the adults. Something more chaotic, more excited, more alive with the particular energy of something young encountering something new. It moved closer, 50 meters from the viewport, 40, 30. At 20 meters, Velcia could see detail. The smaller organism had what she could only call eyes, though they were not eyes in any biological sense she understood. Clusters of photosensitive structures arranged along its leading edge, each one independently mobile, each one tracking a different part of the viewport. Several of them were focused on her face. Several more were fixed on her hands, still pressed against the transparency. One, slightly larger than the others, was focused on her smile. The small creature's bioluminescence settled into a single color, warm amber, matching the pattern of the larger form. A child, Velcia thought, learning the greeting from its parent. She lifted her hand from the viewport and pressed it flat against the transparency, fingers spread, palm outward. "Hello, I am here, I see you." The small creature drifted closer until it was 5 meters from the viewport. At that distance, it was bigger than Velcia's entire field of vision, but somehow it did not feel big. It felt exactly her size. It held position, its photosensitive clusters fixed on her palm, and then its leading surface produced a glow that started at the center and expanded outward in concentric rings, matching the pattern the larger form had made 2 hours earlier. "I see you too." Velcia's breath caught, her eyes filled. She did not wipe them because that would have meant taking her hand off the glass, and she did not want to take her hand off the glass. Not now, not when something she had never imagined was 5 meters away and looking at her and saying, in the only language it had, that she was real and it was real and the distance between them was not as far as it looked. Behind her, Darren was speaking into his comm. She did not hear the words. She heard only the creature's light, pulsing in slow amber waves, and she felt only the cold transparency under her palm and the warmth in her chest, and she understood, with the absolute certainty of a 9-year-old who had spent her entire life looking out of windows at things that were far away, that this was the moment everything changed. On the bridge, Cone made the hardest decision of her career. The tactical situation was clear. 400 hive forms, collectively massing more than the entire Terran Confederacy's active fleet, had surrounded her carrier group in a region of space they could reshape at will. They had demonstrated the ability to manipulate the particle field, clear corridors, and communicate through structured bioluminescence. They had sent a juvenile toward a child. They were, by every available indicator, asking for something. Rennick laid it out. "Commander, the contact has sent what appears to be a juvenile organism within 5 meters of our hull. I cannot classify this as hostile, but I also cannot classify it as safe. We are 4 ships in a field of 400 organisms, any one of which outmasses our escorts. If this is a prelude to encirclement, we are already encircled. If it is a prelude to communication, we are already communicating. Either way, we are committed." Recommendations: military, withdraw. Use the cleared corridor as an exit vector, bring the formation to flank speed, and clear the Harrow corridor before they can reshape the field to block us. We can return with a proper contact fleet, specialists, xeno-diplomats, the entire apparatus. And the diplomatic recommendation. Rennick paused. He was not a diplomat. He was a weapons officer with 20 years of training in the application of force and the assessment of threats. But he was also a man with 2 daughters, and he had been watching the same feed from the observation gallery that everyone on the bridge had been watching, and he had seen the same thing they had all seen. A 9-year-old girl and a young alien, separated by 5 meters of viewport and the entire history of 2 species, looking at each other. "Stay," he said quietly, "and see what happens next." Cone nodded. She did not look at Rennick. She looked at the display, where her daughter's hand was pressed against the glass, and a creature from another world was answering with light. "Helm all stop. Formation holds. Weapons cold. All sections stand down from combat readiness and transition to first contact protocol." "Commander, we do not have a first contact protocol," Hessing said. "Then we are writing one, right now, and the first line is, 'Do not interrupt the conversation.'" The conversation lasted 11 hours. Velsha did not leave the gallery. She refused twice, once when Darren brought food and once when her mother appeared in person, standing in the doorway with an expression that was equal parts fury and something Velsha had never seen on her face before, something soft and uncertain and frightened and proud. Cone looked at her daughter, looked at the creature on the other side of the glass and said nothing. She set a canteen and a ration pack on the gallery bench, touched Velsha's shoulder once, and went back to the bridge. Velsha drank the water without looking away from the viewport. The exchange evolved. Simple shapes gave way to more complex constructions. Velsha drew stars, planets, ships. The creature responded with its own versions, adding context she could not fully understand but could feel. A star rendered not as a point of light but as a radiating web of energy, each strand leading to other bodies, other systems. A map of connections rather than a map of positions. It was showing her how it saw the universe. Not as a collection of objects in empty space, but as a web of relationships, every point connected to every other point, nothing isolated, nothing alone. At the 5th hour, Velsha tried something she had never drawn before. She breathed on the glass and drew a crude outline of the adamant vigil, a long rectangle with triangles for the bow and engine nacelles, with small circles for viewports along the side. She pointed at the drawing, then tapped the viewport, then pointed out at the carrier's hull visible through the gallery's lateral panels. The creature studied the drawing. Then it produced something that made Darren stand up from the bench and come to the viewport. The creature rendered the adamant vigil in bioluminescent detail, not the crude rectangle Velsha had drawn. A precise, scaled representation of the carrier's hull, accurate to the placement of sensor arrays and weapons mounts and the forward observation gallery itself, a tiny bright point on the ship's bow. The creature had been looking at the vigil for 5 hours. It had memorized every external feature, and now it showed Velsha what it saw when it looked at her ship, a metal shell, cold and sealed and blind, with one warm point of light at the front where a small organic was pressing its hands against the wall and trying to see out. The warm point was rendered in gold. Everything else was rendered in cool blue. Velsha stared. The creature saw her ship the way she saw a house at night, mostly dark, mostly closed, with one lit window where someone was home. She pointed at the gold point in the creature's rendering, then she pointed at herself, then she waved. The gold point in the rendering pulsed. The creature understood that the gold point was her. It understood that the rest of the ship was not her. It understood the difference between the part of the human vessel that was trying to communicate and the part that was sealed and armed and watching from behind instruments. It had looked at the adamant vigil and seen, in its own visual language, the exact thing that Cone's bridge crew had been debating for hours, that this encounter was happening because one person had chosen to be visible. On the bridge, Sorrel nearly knocked his console off its mounting. "Commander, the contact just produced a detailed external rendering of the vigil, accurate to within 0.3% of our actual hull geometry. It has been mapping us visually since contact, and it has identified the gallery as the sole active communication point. It distinguished between our observation gallery and our weapons emplacements. It knows which parts of this ship are talking and which parts are threatening. Can it tell the difference? Cone asked. It just demonstrated that it can, Commander. The rendering shows the gallery in gold and everything else in blue. If I were reading this as a diplomatic signal, I would say the contact is telling us. We know you are armed. We know you have weapons. We are choosing to talk to the part of you that is not armed. That is a remarkably sophisticated diplomatic message. Cone looked at the display. Her 9-year-old daughter, who could not yet do long division reliably, had just been identified by an alien collective intelligence as the sole point of genuine communication on a warship. The child was, in a sense, the only part of the adamant vigil that the hive forms recognized as honest. There was a moment around the 4th hour when the exchange reached something Velsha did not know how to name. She had run out of simple shapes. Circles, triangles, stars, constellations, stick figures, spirals. She had drawn everything she could think of, and the creature had matched and extended every one. They had exhausted the vocabulary of geometry. What came next would have to be something harder. Velsha breathed on the viewport and drew 2 shapes. The first was the stick figure she had drawn before, the one the creature had already learned to recognize as her. The second was a smaller figure, close to the first, with its arms extended toward the larger one. Herself and her mother, but she did not draw the connecting line yet. She waited. The creature watched. Its photosensitive clusters tracked the 2 figures. Then it produced its own version, 2 hive forms, one large, one small, the small one close to the large one. Separate, unconnected. Velsha drew the line between the 2 stick figures. Mother and daughter connected. The creature added a thread of light between its 2 hive forms. Parent and child connected. Velsha drew a heart shape above the line. The creature paused. This was not geometry. This was not cartography or mathematics or any category it could extend through logical elaboration. This was something else, something that had no shape in any system, and its light flickered through rapid, uncertain patterns as it tried to find an equivalent. Then the larger form behind it intervened. Its bioluminescence flared in a slow, deep pulse that traveled through the cleared corridor and washed over the small creature, bathing it in warm gold. The small creature's uncertainty vanished. Its light steadied, and above the thread connecting its 2 hive forms it produced not a heart but something else, a sustained glow, formless, warm, radiating in all directions, not a shape but an emission, not a symbol for the feeling but the feeling itself made visible. Warmth without boundary, attachment without condition. Velsha stared at it, her throat closed. She understood that the creature had just told her something its species did not have a shape for either, and that it had found a way to say it anyway, the same way she had, by making something up. She drew her family, herself small, her mother taller, a line connecting them, heart shape above. The creature studied this for a long time. Its bioluminescence cycled through patterns she had not seen before, complex and rapid, and the larger form behind it shifted its light in resonance, and the hive forms across the formation shifted with it, a cascading wave of color that traveled through the entire collective in seconds. They were thinking, all of them, together. Then the small creature produced its response. A central form, large, surrounded by hundreds of smaller forms, each one connected to the central form and to each other by threads of light. Not a family in the human sense, a collective, a mind made of many bodies, each one precious, each one necessary, none of them alone. Below the collective image, a single small form, separated by a gap from the others. The gap glowed with the same amber light the larger organism had been using since the beginning of the exchange. The small, isolated form pulsed with a different color, pale blue, uncertain, reaching. The small form in the image drifted across the gap and connected with the larger collective. The amber and blue lights merged into gold. Velsha understood. The image was not a description. It was an offer. Come closer, join. Be part of this. You do not have to be alone. Her tears fell freely now, and she pressed both palms flat against the viewport and leaned her forehead against the cold transparency and whispered, "We're not alone either." The creature's light bloomed gold, and behind it, every hive form in the corridor did the same. And for a moment the entire Harrow corridor was filled with warm gold light, as if the charged particle field itself had caught fire, as if the universe was answering the one question that Velsha Cohn had been asking every time she pressed her face against a viewport and looked out at the dark. Is anyone there? Someone was there. Someone had always been there. The cost came 6 hours later. Velsha had fallen asleep against the viewport, her breath fogging the transparency in slow rhythms, her hand still pressed flat against the glass. The small creature held position on the other side, its light dimmed to a barely visible glow, matching her sleep the way a parent matches a child's breathing. Darren had draped a thermal blanket over Velsha's shoulders without waking her. He sat on the gallery bench with his back against the bulkhead, watching the child and the creature, his sidearm untouched on his belt, his duty log filling itself with observations he knew would be read by admirals and historians, and people whose names he would never learn. He had a niece Velsha's age. She lived on Mars, in the Tharsis settlement, and the last message he had received from her was a drawing of a horse she had never seen in person. He thought about that drawing now, watching Velsha's small hands flat against the viewport, and he thought about the creature's light dimming to match a child's sleep, and he thought that the universe was kinder than he had been trained to expect. Cohn came to the gallery and stood over her daughter and watched the alien watching her child, and for the first time in 22 years of service, she did not know what to do. The choice was simple in outline and impossible in practice. Stay, and let whatever was happening continue, and risk everything on the assumption that a 9-year-old girl's instinct about a species no human had ever encountered was correct. Or go, and take her daughter to safety, and potentially destroy in the leaving whatever fragile bridge had been built in the drawing and answering of shapes on fogged glass. She chose to wait. She had her crew rotate through shortened rest cycles. She had Sorrel compile every scrap of data the xenolinguistics module had generated. She had Hessing run continuous passive scans of the hive formation, mapping positions, tracking the collective light patterns, building the most detailed picture of an alien civilization that any human being had ever constructed. The picture was extraordinary. The hive forms were not ships. They were organisms as the initial assessment had determined, but they were also something more, a distributed intelligence, a single mind expressed through hundreds of bodies, each body containing subunits that were themselves intelligent, each subunit connected to every other through the bioluminescent network that covered their surfaces. The collective was not a fleet, it was a person. A vast, ancient, impossibly complex person made of living parts, each part aware, each part caring about the others, the whole thing held together not by command structure or hierarchy or law, but by something that the xenolinguistics module, after 7 hours of analysis, tentatively classified as love. The module's classification report read, bonding architecture consistent with deep emotional investment between collective subunits. The bioluminescent exchanges between subunits exhibit characteristics associated with caregiving, reassurance, and grief. The juvenile subunit dispatched to the observation gallery was accompanied by sustained collective attention patterns consistent with parental concern. Preliminary assessment. This species operates on a foundational architecture of emotional interdependence. Hessing added her own analysis in the margins. The collective is ancient. Spectral dating of the chitinous polymer matrix suggests biological material cycling over periods of 50 to 70,000 years. These organisms are not a new species. They have been here in the interstellar medium for longer than human civilization has existed. The Harrow corridor is not an empty transit lane. It is a habitat. We have been flying through their home. Rennick absorbed that quietly, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the professional distance he maintained on duty. They watched us fly through their home without doing anything. How many carrier groups have transited the Harrow corridor in the last 40 years? Dozens. They watched every one of us pass through, and they never once showed themselves. Until now, Hessing said. Why now? Sorrel answered. Because the girl was at the window. Every previous transit involved a sealed ship, blast shutters closed, no organic presence visible at any viewport. We showed them metal and engines and weapons arrays. This time someone was looking out. This time someone was looking for them, and they responded to that. The bridge was quiet. The implications settled over the crew like sediment. A species that had waited thousands of years for someone to look out a window and wonder if anyone was there. Cohn read the report twice. Then she ordered it classified at the highest level and sealed it in the captain's personal log, because she knew that somewhere behind her, in the corridors of power that a military report would eventually reach, there were people who would see a species bound together by love and calculate how to use that against them. People who would read that the hive responded to a child at a window and immediately ask how to weaponize the vulnerability. People who would learn that the collective shared its home coordinates and start building targeting solutions. She would not let that happen, not yet, not while she could prevent it. But she also knew herself well enough to know the limits of her own authority. A carrier commander could classify a report. She could control the narrative for weeks, perhaps months. She could frame the contact as she chose, emphasize the data she believed was important, bury the tactical assessments in appendices that busy admirals might not read. But eventually, the full picture would emerge. Eventually, someone would ask the question that Rennick had already asked. What were the tactical implications of a species held together by emotional bonds? The answer was obvious and terrible. A species that loved could be made to grieve. A species whose juvenile subunits were visibly precious could be threatened through those subunits. A species that built its entire cognitive architecture on the connections between its parts could be broken by severing those connections. She had seen it done to human societies. She had seen generals target hospitals and schools not because they were military objectives, but because they were the things that held a people together, and breaking them broke everything. She had studied those campaigns at the War College, learned to analyze them as strategy, learned to put clinical distance between herself and the implications of what she was being taught. She could not put clinical distance between herself and the creature, whose light was dimming to match her daughter's breathing. She sealed the report. She added one line to her personal log that was not part of the official record. The first species we have met loves its children. If we cannot protect that, we do not deserve what happened today. Velsha woke to a change. The light outside the viewport was different. The hive forms were still there, still amber, still watchful. But the small creature that had been holding position 5 meters from the glass had moved. It was retreating slowly toward the larger form, and its bioluminescence was shifting from the warm amber of the conversation to something else. A deeper color, a blue-violet pulse that Velsha had not seen before, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat winding down. The larger form's light was changing too. The amber was fading, replaced by the same blue-violet, and across the formation, one by one, the other hive forms were transitioning. The gold was going out. Something was ending. Velsha pressed her palms against the viewport. No, wait, don't go. The small creature paused. Its photosensitive clusters oriented toward her. Its light flickered, amber and blue-violet alternating, as if it were caught between two impulses, the pull of the collective drawing it back and the pull of the child drawing it forward. The larger form's light pulsed, a command, a call, come back. The small creature turned toward the larger form, then back toward Velsha. Its light settled into amber for one final pulse, bright and warm and steady, and then it dimmed, and the small creature drifted backward into the surface of the larger organism, reabsorbed into the collective, becoming part of the whole again. The last thing Velcia saw of it was the cluster of photosensitive structures along its leading edge, each one still oriented toward her, still watching, even as the body that carried them merged with the greater mass. It had not wanted to go. She was certain of it. It had wanted to stay, and it had gone anyway, because the collective needed it, because the whole was more important than the part, because that was what love looked like when you were a hive. The blue-violet pulse spread through the formation. The hive forms began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing coordination, flowing through the Harrow corridor in the same migration pattern they had arrived in, their bioluminescence shifting to a deep, steady blue that reminded Velcia of the color of the ocean in pictures she had seen of Earth, a place she had never visited, a world she knew only from images on screens. They were leaving. But not all at once. The departure was orchestrated, deliberate, a choreography of light and motion that Velcia understood was the hive's version of a farewell. The hive forms did not simply turn and swim away. They cycled past the carrier group in a long, slow procession, each one passing close enough for the observation gallery viewport to fill with its surface, close enough for Velcia to see the neural architecture and the subunits and the pulsing networks of light that connected every part to every other part. Each one, as it passed, flared its bioluminescence once. A single pulse of warm amber, directed at the gallery, directed at her. 400 goodbyes, delivered one at a time. Some of the hive forms were enormous, so large that Velcia could not see their edges through the viewport, and they moved past in sections, their surfaces scrolling by like the landscape scene from a train window. Others were compact, barely larger than the escort destroyers, and they passed quickly, their amber flare sharp and bright. A few of the medium-sized forms had juvenile subunits on their surfaces, and these subunits clustered at the edges closest to the gallery as their host bodies drifted past, their photosensitive clusters oriented toward Velcia, their own bioluminescence flickering in the fast, chaotic pattern she had come to recognize as excitement. Children waving at her from their parents' backs as they passed. Velcia waved back at every single one. The procession took nearly 40 minutes. By the end, Velcia's arm was tired and her eyes were raw and her throat ached with the particular soreness that comes from holding back sound. The last hive form in the procession was the largest of all, a vast cathedral of living tissue that blotted out the stars as it passed, its amber pulse slow and deep and final. It held the pulse for 10 full seconds, longer than any other, and then it was gone, and the charged particle field closed behind it like a curtain being drawn. The Harrow corridor was empty again. The adamant vigil and its escorts hung alone in the amber-violet haze, their running lights the only thing moving in the dark. Velcia stood at the viewport for a long time after they were gone. The fog from her breath slowly cleared. The gallery lights shifted from amber back to standard white. The automated lock disengaged with a click, indicating that the contact alert had been downgraded. Darren stood behind her, silent, his sidearm holstered, his report already filed. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than what had just happened. When Cone came to the gallery, she did not speak either. She crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter and put her arms around her, and Velcia leaned into her mother's chest and cried. Not from sadness, not exactly. From the weight of it. From the understanding that she had been given something enormous, and that it had been taken away not because anyone wanted it taken, but because the universe was large and species were different, and the distance between hello and home was longer than any corridor a hive mind could clear. They'll come back, Velcia said into her mother's shoulder. Won't they? Cone held her daughter. She thought about the classified report in her personal log. She thought about the corridors of power and the people who would read the word love in an intelligence assessment and see only leverage. She thought about the creature that had dimmed its light to match a child's sleep, and the collective that had watched through 400 pairs of eyes while a 9-year-old drew pictures on a window. "I think they will," she said. She was not certain. She was almost never certain of anything that mattered. "And we'll be nice to them." Cone closed her eyes. "We will try." "That's not good enough, Mom." Cone pulled back and looked at her daughter's face, streaked with tears, flushed with exhaustion and emotion, and the particular fierceness that Velcia got when she believed something so completely that any deviation from it felt like a wound. 9 years old. 9 years old, and she had just conducted the first conversation between humans and an alien intelligence, armed with nothing but a foggy window and a wave, and the unshakable conviction that anything that said hello deserved hello back. "No," Cone said, "you are right, it is not good enough." She stood, she took Velcia's hand. She walked with her daughter out of the gallery and through the corridor to the bridge, where the entire command staff stood at their stations, watching the empty Harrow corridor on the main display. "Sorrel," Cone said, "prepare a full contact report. Classification, highest. Addressee, Confederacy High Command Exploration Division Xenological Council. The report will contain every data point, every exchange, every bioluminescent pattern, every module analysis. It will also contain my personal recommendation." "And what is your recommendation, Commander?" Cone looked down at Velcia, standing beside her on the bridge. Too small for the chair, too young for the rank, too important for anyone in the room to pretend otherwise. "My recommendation is that when they come back, we send someone who listens before they calculate, someone who waves before they scan, someone who draws before they target." She squeezed Velcia's hand. "My recommendation is that we send our best." Sorrel looked at the commander. He looked at the girl. He looked at the empty corridor on the display, where 400 living minds had just made a journey across the dark to say hello and had been answered by a child who did not know enough to be afraid. "Understood, Commander. Preparing the report." Rennick cleared his throat. "Commander, one additional item for the record." "Go ahead." "I want it noted that in 20 years of fleet service, I have trained for first contact exactly once, during a tabletop exercise at the War College. The scenario assumed hostiles. Every scenario assumed hostiles. Every doctrine we have, every protocol, every contingency plan assumed that the first species we met would either be a threat to be managed or a resource to be evaluated." He paused. "Nobody planned for this. Nobody planned for the possibility that the first species we met would come to us because a child was looking out a window. And nobody planned for the possibility that the correct response was to let the child keep looking." Cone looked at him. "Are you making a recommendation, Chief?" "I am making an observation. We spend a lot of time training people to fight, Commander. Maybe we should spend some of it training them to wave." "Noted. Put it in the report." Cone nodded. She stood on the bridge of the adamant vigil with her daughter's hand in hers, and she looked out at the dark where the hive forms had been, and she allowed herself, for one moment, to believe that what Velcia had started in the observation gallery was not an ending but a first word. The first word of a conversation that would take years to learn, and decades to master, and lifetimes to finish. And it had started the way the best conversations always started, with someone small and someone strange, and the courage to wave first. Velcia leaned against her mother's hip and looked out at the stars and did not cry anymore. She was thinking about the small creature's light, the way it had settled into amber at the end, steady and warm and sure. She was thinking about the drawing it had made, the two figures side by side, connected. She was thinking that the distance between them was not space. It was not vacuum or charged particles or the incomprehensible gap between carbon and silicon, between individual and collective, between a girl and a hive. The distance was just the time it took to learn how to say the same things in different light. And they had already started. 3 weeks later, the adamant vigil docked at Meridian Station, and Commander Cone's classified report traveled up the chain of command at a speed that surprised even her. Within 2 days, The Confederacy Xenological Council had convened an emergency session. Within a week, the first research fleet had been authorized. Within a month, 3 ships were being outfitted for a return transit of the Harrow Corridor, their blast shutters permanently removed and replaced with full-length observation transparencies, their weapons arrays powered down and locked under diplomatic seal. The crew manifest for the return mission was debated for weeks. Scientists, linguists, xenobiologists, diplomats, the Confederacy's best minds, argued over in committee rooms and conference calls and classified briefings that generated more paper than the contact itself. Velcia followed the debates from her bunk aboard the Vigil, reading dispatches on her mother's datapad when Cone was not looking, which was often, because Cone was looking at the dispatches too, and some of the names being proposed made her jaw tighten in the way that meant she was disappointed in people she outranked. "They want to send weapons specialists," Cone told Rennick during a late-shift briefing that Velcia was definitely not supposed to be listening to from the corridor outside the ready room. Disguised as systems analysts, 3 of them embedded in the science team, in case the contact turns hostile. "Will you allow it?" "I will not. And when they overrule me, which they will, I will ensure that the weapons specialists are assigned to the engineering section, as far from the observation galleries as I can put them. And I will recommend that the first person through the gallery door is someone under the age of 10. Rennick looked at her. "You cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious about anything in my career." The Hive responded to a child. Not to our weapons, not to our sensors, not to our mathematics, not to our rank structure. To a child. The single most important diplomatic insight in human history is that a 9-year-old girl waved at something she did not understand and it waved back. If we send adults with agendas and weapons and classified objectives, we will lose what she built. "You would send your daughter." Cone's expression did not change. "I would give my daughter the choice, which is more than anyone has offered the Hive." Velcia, in the corridor, pressed her forehead against the bulkhead and closed her eyes and thought about the creature's light, steady and amber and warm, and she already knew what her answer would be. She would go back. She would stand at the viewport again, and she would wave, and she would wait for the amber pulse that meant someone on the other side of the dark remembered her. She would go back because that was what you did when someone said hello across an impossible distance. You said hello back. And then you kept talking until the distance did not matter anymore.